December 23, 2010, at a Quick Trip gas station in Des Moines, Iowa, a heavyset man wearing a black hoodie pulled over his head, walked up to the cashier and purchased 2 hot dogs, a fountain drink, and 2 tickets from the Hot Lotto lottery. Unbeknownst to those in that gas station, this man had just set in motion a series of events that would unearth the biggest single lottery scam in United States history. Hello, welcome to Office Hours, where we dissect a strange story, perhaps a little bit more than what we ever should. I am the live professor, and this is my teaching assistant. We'll call him Marty. And today is about the Bigfoot hunter who pulled off the biggest single lottery scam in US history. Well, that brings us around to the hero of today's story. And yes, there is an honest-to-God hero for this tale. A hard-boiled detective worthy of his own film noir movie, and his name is Rob Sand. In 2014, Rob Sand was the Iowa Assistant Attorney General, generally specializing in white-collar crime, and was the youngest member of the 9-person prosecution team during the time of this story. And one day in early 2014, his boss, an Iowa Deputy Attorney General named Thomas H. Miller, was retiring, and he was handing off his case files to his team members. And the one that wound up on Rob's desk was one of the strangest that the department had ever seen. It was specifically the case of an unclaimed $16 million winning lottery ticket that had happened just a few years before. As the case currently stood, it was a complete dead end. The department had done everything in their power, up to and including involving the FBI to solve this case, but nothing had worked. And the craziest part is that the investigators weren't even really sure if a crime had taken place. That's how insane this case was. The surveillance footage showed a man walking into a Quick Trip convenience store in Des Moines, Iowa. It was a weekday afternoon, just 2 days before Christmas. And the one piece of luck that they did seem to have in this case was the actual surveillance footage itself. Because while, yes, nearly every convenience store in America has some kind of recording, almost none of them have audio recording to go with the footage. This one did.
Hello. Hello. Can we your hot dogs?
Yes, sir.
317.
And how'd you get it?
I'll look it up on my those 2 right there. You want the silver?
No thanks.
The 2 slips of paper that the man stuffed in his pockets were slips for the Hot Lotto lottery game, a Powerball-like lottery game available in 14 states, including Iowa. Players or the game's computer pick 5 numbers between 1 and 39, and then a 6th number, known as the hot ball, between 1 and 19. The prize for getting the first 5 numbers right was $10,000. But like many Powerball games, you got a much larger prize if you also got the last number correct. The stated odds of winning this game were 1 in 10,939,383. At 3:24 p.m., the cashier ran the slips through the lottery terminal, and the man walked outside. Once outside, he pulled down his hood and got into his SUV and drove away. And once again, this was the biggest piece of evidence that Rob Sand had to work on for his case. But you may be wondering, what's the actual issue here? Once again, it didn't seem like the guy actually, did any crime. Well, the true mystery would begin on December 29, 2010. The Hot Lotto drawing occurs. Numbers 3, 12, 16, 26, 33, and the hot ball of 11 come up, which meant that there was a $16 million reward for one of the tickets that this man had purchased. And as is typical form for the Iowa lottery, 7 days later, they would announce that that specific Quick Trip had sold the $16 million winning ticket. But no one came forward, which is strange because if you know someone who plays the lottery, you know that they follow that stuff like they're getting manna from heaven. Usually they're beating down the doors of the headquarters to get the lottery money. So a week with no response was definitely strange. But this strangeness increased when the radio silence had went up to a month with no one coming to redeem the ticket. And so the Iowa State Lottery made a press announcement saying, hey, these are the numbers. If you bought the ticket at this place on this day, please come and get your $16 million. And as you can predict, as soon as they made this announcement, they were suddenly besieged by thousands of people saying that, I had bought that ticket, I've just lost it, or like my girlfriend stole it, I had to go to my cat's dance recital. And there's a story that gets repeated in every one of these retellings about a guy who calls in saying that his best friend was an avid lottery player, but he had just died in a car wreck. And the friend was wanting to know, should he go to the junkyard to look through, the bloody, mangled car because he would keep his lottery tickets sometime in his sun visor or something. I mean, he's not going to use it. And while annoying and clogging up the system, these calls really didn't have any chance of getting through because the lottery had two pieces of information that they had kept private: the actual serial number for the lottery ticket and the aforementioned videotape surveillance footage. And while the false calls did keep coming in, none of them could produce the serial number, and none of them were actually the guy who had bought it. And so months went by. And this was truly unprecedented. One lottery official said that since 1999, she had dealt with over 200 people who had won $1 million, and none of them had let it go this long without being claimed. Now, it's not completely unprecedented. I mean, there have been actual, honest-to-God, billion-dollar tickets that have went unclaimed. Good God. And the general consensus in the office at that time was that the ticket had become lost or damaged to the point of not being able to be redeemed, or there were people fighting over it because, one person had bought it for another person, something like that. Or the person had won the big lotto and had went up to see the man upstairs. And the reason why the lottery was so, motivated to have this person come in and collect these winnings is because people winning the lottery is the best single advertisement for the lottery. They want them to come in, take the photos because, hey, you see this schmuck? You too could be that schmuck if you just, keep buying the lottery. And while lottery officials discussed the possibility that they may have to, in fact, redistribute the winnings amongst the lotto system, there was one thing that was in the back of their minds. What if this person did not want to come forward because they could not be publicly identified? Because Iowa is one of the states where you have to be publicly named if you win the lottery, what if this person's anonymity was worth $16 million? This question was answered when nearly a year after the ticket had been purchased on November 9th, 2011, a lawyer from Quebec City, Canada, named Philip Johnston called in with the correct serial number for the lottery ticket. And while he did give the correct lottery ticket serial number, it was very apparent that, there was something going on with P. Johnson over here.
Not like I do business in Des Moines or invest in your lottery regularly.
So,
No, I bought the ticket. I mean, I bought the ticket and I bought the ticket. I've got the dates. I don't have the ticket, unfortunately, yet, but it's on its way.
Johnston was just thoroughly not convincing over the course of the phone call. He also said that whenever he purchased the ticket, that he was wearing a sport coat and gray flannel trousers. Philip said that he wanted to collect the earnings, but he was just simply too sick to travel, so, could they just send the money up or whatever. But, the lottery was like, maybe not, because, you're literally the most suspicious human on the planet, my guy. Also, I love that you can tell that this guy is a lawyer because he's like, what do the poors wear whenever they're buying, their lottery tickets? What's the least formal outfit that I can possibly think of? Oh, sport coat and trousers. How can you be a lawyer and be this bad at lying? In a later call, Philip Johnston admitted that he had in fact fibbed in the earlier call, and he was not the man who had purchased the lottery ticket. Shocking. He was trying to collect on behalf of his client, who wanted to stay anonymous. However, as I just previously mentioned, that is against the rules. And whenever he was getting pushed on the matter, P. Johnston was just like, maybe I'll just actually retract my claim. Maybe I don't want the $16 million, okay? I'm kind of a rich guy up here in Quebec City, okay? That's how this guy talks, okay? But things became even stranger when 1 year to the day after the winning lottery ticket had been won, with 1 hour and 50 minutes left on the time when you could actually claim it, representatives from a prominent Des Moines law firm showed up to the lottery headquarters with the winning ticket signed to a trust. So the representative stated they had gotten the ticket from a lawyer in New York named Crawford Shaw, not P. Johnston. Shaw had signed the ticket as a trustee of a shell corporation called Hexam Investment Trust. But the only thing is that Crawford Shaw had misspelled the name of his own shell company on the ticket. So they couldn't claim it because they had misspelled the name of their own company. They're just so bad. Later, the lottery found out that the president of Hexam Investments was Philip Johnston, the lawyer from Canada. But because the name of the investment firm had been misspelled on the ticket, they could not claim it. At least that's what I've heard. I don't know if he had just spelled it correctly, if this would have went through. I am, believe it or not a legal expert on lottery claimings in Iowa. Even if it's just a red herring, it's still funny that they messed up on literally the simplest thing that you could ever possibly do. It just goes to show, if you got any legal advice from any of these lawyers at any point in the last 20 years, get a second opinion. 2 weeks later, Crawford Shaw himself would show up from New York trying to essentially bribe the lottery into giving him the winnings, saying like, I'll give a portion of this to, any charitable cause of your choice. And then he was like, you know what? I'm actually going to sue you guys for not giving me the winnings. And they're like, yeah, that's fine, because your client's name will come up in the legal filings for this case. And at that point he was like, lawsuit retracted. And shortly afterwards, the Lottery Commission got a fax piece of paper that said, we are retracting our claim. And so, as discussed in February 2012, the winnings from that lottery ticket were redistributed amongst the states that participated in the Hot Lotto lottery, because the ticket had simply never been successfully legally claimed. If things had been suspicious before, it was actual conspiracy level now, and the Iowa Attorney's General Office and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations opened a case into investigating who actually purchased the ticket. And it turned out that things were even stranger, because in an interview in Quebec City, Philip Johnston told investigators that he had been contacted by a Houston attorney named Robert Sonfield. Johnston also pointed investigators towards a Sugar Land, Texas businessman named Robert Rhodes. Remember that name, it may come up later. And while they did later go to Texas to try and find Sonfeld and Rhodes, nothing ever came up. And this all brings us up to date with what Rob Sands knew about the case whenever he was assigned the file in 2014, which is to say, not much. And even with the scan information that they had, most of it was contradictory. Even though that someone was saying that like Robert Rhodes had been the one who purchased the tickets, the footage itself clearly showed that was not the case. And so with literally nothing left to lose, and with only 3 months left on the statute of limitations for this case, Rob Sand released the surveillance footage to the public. The reason why that they had not released the footage up until now was because they just simply did not want to have, mass confusion or, more and more false positives that they were already having with this case. But with the release of the surveillance footage, everything changed. In Des Moines, a web developer at the Iowa Lottery who had watched the video also recognized the voice. It belonged to a man that she had worked with for years, and whenever she saw the tape, she said, "Why am I listening to a video of Eddie?" By Eddie, she meant Eddie Tipton, the Information Security Director for the Multi-State Lottery Association, the organization that runs lottery for 33 states, including Iowa. It was based in the Des Moines suburbs, and amongst the games that it ran was the Hot Lotto. This brings us to the main character of our story today, Eddie Tipton. Eddie, who had grown up in rural Texas, was always kind of known for his computer skills. And while it would be very nice for me to come in here and it would work well with the story if I was like, Eddie was like this tortured soul who, was this complete outcast. He was on his Joker arc, bro. That is just not the case. Never in my life have I ever read of a person in any type of criminal case that was so beloved. While he could be a little bit paranoid, like he wouldn't use credit cards because he thought that people may, trace him, something which may make sense as we go along. Every single person that has been interviewed in this case that knew Eddie in any way, shape, or form is like, he was the nicest human being I have ever met. Words like heart of gold or just a good guy consistently come up with every single person. Like I've literally not seen anybody talk about him who was not like an angel in human form whenever I was around him. The only kind of shadow that was in Eddie's life was kind of a sense of overarching loneliness. While he was a D&D player and he was active in World of Tanks, it just kind of seemed that Eddie was a little bit lonely. In private moments, he would tell his friends that he really just wanted more than anything to have a family, which is why he had invested all of his savings into his house so he could fill it with that family. But the right partner never came, and he constantly invited friends and people to come over to stay. He just kind of was a little bit lonely from what everyone could tell. He's just got a big heart. He's not like you and me, Diogenes. We have each other. But the other thing was the reason why Eddie Tipton had to justify putting all of his savings into building this house was because Eddie Tipton lived in the McMansion, the likes that few have ever seen. It was a 4,800 square foot, $540,000 house in the cornfields south of Des Moines. 5 bedrooms, a huge basement, pool table, shuffleboard table, stadium style home theater, pool and a basketball court. Whenever his boss, who was like, I know exactly how much you make, why do you have a bigger house than I do? He was like, I got money from my family. You know, hey, I'm just kind of a lucky guy. What can I say? But princely estate aside, Eddie's life seemed to kind of just revolve around his job. There was a lot of long days, and it was not strange for him to show up at 8 and leave at 11. So, and during these 60-hour weeks, he would improve security, firewalls, and also approve the actual lottery code itself. But all this comes around to say, Eddie Tipton was the man who controlled the code of the lottery that selected the lottery winners. Where will this come up in the story? This meant that Eddie Tipton safeguarded the code, which was the selector for the Hot Lotto lottery that he had purchased a ticket of in Des Moines, Iowa at that quick trip. Because while everyone who saw the videotape was heartbroken because Eddie Tipton was once again literally an angel in human form apparently, no one could deny that is not Eddie Tipton. Like, cause that's just, they just saw that and they're like, that is a Eddie shape right there, brother. I've never seen something that looks more Eddie than this guy. That's what they said. November 2014, state investigators showed up at Tipton's office. And while he did tell him about his family in Texas, he did not mention Robert Rhodes, the man who had initially passed this $16.5 million ticket to an attorney. And by searching through Eddie Tipton's LinkedIn profile, which will strangely enough come up later, they found out that the two, Robert and Eddie, had actually worked together at one point in time and were in fact best friends and vacationed together. And further phone records show that they had been in contact on the day that he had purchased that ticket. Tipton was arrested in January 2015, and as he was being led out of his house, he apparently was just consistently saying, "Why now? Why now?" Almost as if he was wondering, why am I getting in trouble for it now after I've gotten away for it for so many years? This trial for Eddie Tipton was pretty interesting, with Rob Sand going up in front of the court saying, "This is a classic story about an inside job. A man who, by virtue of his employment, is not allowed to play the lottery, nor allowed to win, buys a lottery ticket, wins, and passes the ticket along to friends to be claimed by someone unconnected to him. This story, though, has a 21st century twist. That twist is specifically how Tipton would have rigged the lottery system. So the classic version of like the ball lottery that you all know and love is that there's a bunch of ping pong balls that have numbers written on them, and then someone grabs in there and like gets a hold of one of the balls, and those are the numbers for that week. But people usually don't like doing that anymore, even though that it is the most common, because there's so many ways to manipulate it by making some of the balls heavier or making some of the balls at different temperatures so the person in there grabbing it knows which one that they're getting a hold of. There's ways to manipulate it so that that happens. And because of that, the Hot Lotto system ran off of the computer model, which is where essentially you have two people in a room with a computer that is constantly being surveyed that produces the code which chooses the winner for that lottery. So strangely enough, the actual way that the lottery winner was selected was by radioactivity. The random seed which would generate the actual code was from a Geiger counter measuring the radioactive element of a smoke detector, and that instant Geiger reading, which changed constantly and was completely random, would go into the algorithm that would generate the winning numbers. Basically, it's a situation where the Geiger counter was reading, this randomly associated number, and if it came out like a 1, let's say it produced a triangle out for the code. But if it read a 2, it would produce a square. That's like the Sesame Street version of this, gambling. Gambling for children, if you will. That random number is called the seed, and seed is plugged into the algorithm, and a pseudo-random number generator called the Mezzarine Twister produces the actual winning numbers. But Rob Sand's case really centered around the idea that Eddie Tipton had somehow, through his computer skills, produced a rootkit that had self-deleted but had manipulated the code. Sand's theory was that at some point, Tipton had went into that room that the computer which controlled the code existed and at some point had put in a flash drive or something like that to put in this code, which could maliciously change the actual winning formula such that Eddie would know how to win the lotto. And while Rob Sand did have very good ideas on why he thought that this had happened, this was just simply a theory at the time. And because of that, Tipton's defense attorney ran wild with this, saying that this was the Mission Impossible theory, saying that this was ridiculous. He even produced a great quote from old Al Einstein saying, "Logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you anywhere." Take that, Rob. The defense attorney also brought in the jackhammer, which was Eddie Tipton's brother, Tommy Tipton, who said in the video, Eddie bought 2 hot dogs. However, he knew that that couldn't be Eddie because, quote, Eddie's just not a hot dog type of guy. Case closed. And even though that Eddie did the interview with the Daily Beast saying that he had been unfairly targeted and he was just being, persecuted against because whatever reason, the court could see that, like, this is the guy who had access to the code that, selects the winner of the lottery. Also, once again, it's completely illegal for him to play it because of the laws of the lottery. Yeah, he may have probably have done that thing that they were saying that he did. That he did. They were like, yeah. And so the jury found him guilty on July 20th, 2015 and sentenced him to 10 years. And while Rob Sand certainly felt quite justified after he had kind of cracked the case, at least to the court, this would be a very short-lived victory, as Eddie Tipton never actually served any time in jail. He was able to stay out until the appeal had went up to the Iowa Supreme Court, who overturned the judgment because it had ran over the statute of limitations. So, Eddie Tipton essentially had manipulated this situation such that he literally was getting off scot-free for the case, even though that it had been proven in court that, yeah, he probably did the thing. And so, while many people would feel quite, rightfully defeated after that, Sand still had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. And he said that, there's no way that even if this one got thrown out, that this was the only time that Eddie Tipton had ever bought a fraudulent ticket if he knew how to manipulate the code. People usually don't get caught on their first attempt, or second, or even third. And from everything that it seemed in the case, Eddie Tipton knew what he was doing. This had not been his first time. But until any new evidence came out, Rob just had to wait. And that new evidence came when one morning a Texas number rung Rob Sand's office saying, "Did y'all know that Eddie Tipton's brother, Tommy Tipton, won the lottery about 10 years back?" That's my recreation of the phone call. This, you could say, piqued Sand's interest, and so he got in contact with the Texas authorities in that area. And as soon as he was able to get a hold of the FBI agent in that area, the guy was like, "Oh yeah, that's my Bigfoot case." I told you that there was going to be Bigfoot in this story. Basically, the case about Tommy Tipton revolved around a man named Tom Vargas, who had contacted local law enforcement in 2006 with a very suspicious story. Vargas owned 44 fireworks stands in Texas, and as any fireworks dealer in Texas, twice a year he made mucho dinero on 4th of July and on New Year's. So because of the nature of his job, he had to carry massive amounts of cash, sometimes up to $500,000 at once. And it was right after New Year's, during this period, that people knew that he would have this amount of money. A local justice of the peace who had shod one of this guy's horses called him up and said, "Hey, can you change out $400,000 of used bills for me?" This brought up many questions for Vargas, such as, wait, what? And number two, well, you're justice of the peace. You make $35,000 a year. How do you have $450,000 in new bills? I said used bills, I meant new bills, that you wanted to switch out with my used bills. What? And so Vargas contacted the sheriff, who got him in contact with the FBI, who put him on a wire. And so Vargas met up with, Tommy Tipton, presumably in like a Walmart parking lot, and they handed each other like a briefcase with $450,000. Tommy Tipton had brand new bills. Vargas had the firework street money, and they switched it out. Now, while it's not strictly illegal to, change out bills in the Walmart parking lot or whatever, it is, you know, the most suspicious thing that a public official can do. It's like literally wearing a shirt that says, "I am corrupt" on it. Now, where this turns into the cryptozoological is when the FBI agent who was investigating this figured out that Tommy Tipton had wound up in the hospital because he had fallen out of a tree stand and broke, you know, both of his legs because he had been out hunting Bigfoot. Tipton would later go on to say, "My grandmother was raised on a farm in Arkansas where this creature would come and harass all the farm animals. My grandmother would tell me all these stories of this animal that harassed my family. And then something happened to me in Louisiana where I actually watched these animals for a couple of hours, and I've been hooked ever since." As the FBI learned in this investigation, Tommy Tipton was a member of the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. Now, for the actual, you know, $450,000 that he was exchanging in that Walmart parking lot, I keep saying that, but there's no reason to believe that it wasn't Walmart. Other than it's Texas, so it definitely had to be in the Walmart parking lot. Tommy Tipton told the FBI agent that he had in fact won the lottery, and that he had one of his friends collect the winnings for him in exchange for part of the cut, just so he didn't have to give any to his wife, who he was currently fighting with. And apparently, that seemed kind of scummy enough of a thing that the FBI was like, yeah, he probably did that. So they thought, case closed. Which brings up, like, I guess that's not illegal. I don't know. I'm not an expert on lottery collecting, you know, legality, but it comes up a lot in this story. You felt like that would have, you know, gotten him in trouble, but I wasn't there. Not an FBI agent, okay? However, it should be noted that it's not just Tommy that was obsessed with Bigfoot. Both Eddie and Tommy Tipton were absolutely just devoted to finding Sasquatch. In fact, Eddie had like a clump of hair that he had given to a scientist who said, well, it's not human and it's not animal, which meant for Eddie, obviously 100% Sasquatch hair. Case closed. But back in Iowa, you know, you can see like Rob Sand like blinking as he's getting this phone call. He starts putting together, maybe there's some truth about this, like handing off to a Bigfoot hunting friend to collect their lottery winnings. If that's the cover story for Tommy, maybe there's something more behind this. And as it turns out, while none of them had actually found Bigfoot, Eddie and Tommy's friends were the luckiest sons of guns in the world. They found out that in 2008, Robert Rhodes had won $780,000 in Wisconsin's lottery. And some other members of the extended Eddie friend group included the man named Kyle Kahn, who had won $600,000 in the Oklahoma lottery. There was also a woman named Amy DeMoney who had won over $1 million. DeMoney, Kahn, this is getting silly, okay? They also noticed that several tickets had been purchased on the route and time during Eddie would have been traveling home for the holidays. A bit strange. And as this pattern kept coming up again and again in these different situations, Rob Sand was actually able to go out and talk to some of these people, and it gave him an idea of what Eddie Tipton may have actually been doing. One person that talked to Sand said she had gone on a date with Tipton, but that their relationship had become platonic. Tipton later told the woman that he had won the lottery, but he wasn't able to claim the winning ticket because of his job. If she could just claim it, she could keep a significant portion of a gift for her recent engagement. And because of these interviews, Rob Sand had a pretty good idea of how physically Eddie would go about collecting on these lottery tickets. He or someone else would purchase the ticket, and then whenever the time came to collect the winnings, someone else would actually go to claim it and be the person who says, hey, I won the lottery, get the photo taken. They would keep part of it, and the rest would go back to Eddie. The only thing that was missing from this story was the actual computer code that would have been used to direct the lottery, to manipulate it in such a way that Eddie was always able to win. However, that was coming. Rob Sand thought that the Iowa State computers had wiped themselves clean after the rootkit had come and changed the code, so it was impossible to detect them off of those computers. But if any of the other states in the Hot Lotto system had kept their computers, they may still be on the hard drive. And sure enough, that happened. Wisconsin discovered that they had their random number generating computers used for the 2007 sitting in storage. And after they hired a computer expert to do some forensic analysis and reverse engineering, they were able to find the code. And what they found was that the code did in fact exist. It was just so small that you really wouldn't have been able to detect it unless if you were specifically looking for that exact type of code within the large file size. And this was enough to be the smoking gun. And while Eddie Tipton had claimed innocence up until this point in all the dealings of this case, once Rob Sand was able to produce the code that Eddie Tipton definitely created to rig the lottery, Eddie Tipton broke and immediately began negotiating for a guilty plea. As part of the plea deal, Tipton had to come clean about how he fixed the lottery. This would help improve lottery security and would make it such that Eddie would not be subject to further charges. Tipton's program was called QVRNG.DLL, Quantum Vision Random Number Generator. Tipton said it was never an evil plan to get rich. It was never my intent to start a full-out ticket scam. It occurred to me, wow, I could do this. I could be making a living doing this. If this was like some mob-related thing, I'd just give this information to the mob and they would go and win the lotteries left and right. No one would know. But I don't have any mob ties. I don't know anybody. I gave the tickets to friends and family. The way that the actual code worked was it had to be a Wednesday or Saturday evening on one of the 3 days in a non-leap year. The 147th day of the year, which was May 27th, the 327th day, which is November 23rd, or the 363rd day, which is December 29th. These were the days that usually fell around holidays, Memorial Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, in which Tipton was often off on vacation. If those criteria were satisfied, the random number generators were diverted on a different track from their normal code. At that point, the algorithm would use a predetermined seed number that restricted the pool of potential winning numbers to a much smaller, predictable set of numbers. So what that meant was on these specific times during these specific dates, it wasn't like this 1 to 10 million chance that you would actually win. It was actually 1 in a couple hundred because of these pre-selected codes. He had in fact put the code into the computer during the scheduled update time for daylight savings time while the people weren't going to be particularly watching him that hard. And also the surveillance camera only captured 1 second of every minute in that room. And so during these times, Eddie would tell his friends, play these numbers during this time because you're going to win. In the interview, it also confirmed some suspicions that Eddie had actually by the end wanted to be caught. While he had been performing the scam since 2005, in the interview he said, it was more like I was ready for it to be gone. It was never my intent to go out there and start winning all these lotteries. It was just, like I said, step by step it happened. The judge sentenced Tipton to a maximum of 25 years in prison. His restitution payments to the various state lotteries came out to $2.2 million, even though Tipton himself had only pocketed around $350,000 from the scams, the rest going to those who claimed the tickets. It also should be noted that the whole I only got $350,000 from this was not believed by the prosecutors at all, as they point to the, once again, giant McMansion and the other lavish expenses that, Eddie Tipton had at his house. Also, Robert Rhodes and Tommy Tipton received other sentences for their part in these crimes. And whenever Eddie actually went to prison, it seemed that things were not actually going that well for him. Eddie apparently got made fun of quite a bit because he was quite a large lad and he was apparently fond of eating quite a bit of snacks, which he was, mercilessly made fun of by the other prisoners. However, I don't think that Eddie felt that bad because he only served 5 years of his sentence. He was also able to largely avoid paying restitution payments and actually at one point tried to sue the state of Iowa for, this like malicious restitution payments or whatever. That case was thrown out, but he didn't quite pay all that much for his crimes. Eddie Tipton today apparently lives in a very modest home in Texas and does not give any interviews. And most people who knew the case and knew Eddie Tipton personally say that it was just the case of a man who was presented with the ultimate temptation who just gave in. Today, the Eddie Tipton case is remembered as an impetus for the lottery system to, upgrade their security. It also brought in a lot of just, scrutiny under like, how honest is the lottery? Because if this is something that happened once, it's probably happened again. In a very funny element, Robert Rhodes now works at a cybersecurity firm. Can't make that up. And so, after he won the highest profile case of his career, Rob Sand actually quit his job and went on to run for state auditor, which he did win. And now, Rob Sand has announced his candidacy for governor of Iowa. So, I guess if you thought that he was a very admirable guy in this story, you can just go and vote for him if you live in the great U.S. state of Iowa. Which really just leaves the ultimate question from this case of, what are we going to do as a society whenever the Tipton brothers actually find honest-to-God Sasquatch out in Texas? Because if anyone's going to find it, it's going to be these two. And at that point, they just get their own prestige TV show on HBO. I don't know how as a society we're going to live with this reality. I'm scared for our children, okay? I got the majority of the information for this video from this New York Times article, and this documentary. And if you want to see even more information that will just blow your brain, you can watch it in this video right here.